despite the reality that it was quite warm in the autumn in this part of the South Atlantic, the current weather was not at all pleasing to the short man who sat in front of the brightly burning fireplace that evening. His apartment at Longwood House was pretty spacious, but it stood in an open area blown by the ocean winds. He wanted to live closer to the mountains, where the wind didn't blow so much, but not much depended on his desires now. Well, the ancients were right. Via victis, hardship to the vanquished. If you ask any ordinary citizen to name the top 3 most famous conquerors, they will almost certainly include Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is not surprising because this Corsican by origin man managed to grow from a simple artillery officer to the Emperor of France in a few years, and then subjugate most of continental Europe. But how did he acquire such a dizzying position? Perhaps he knew something that others simply didn't. Today, we will discuss a groundbreakingly influential and unique individual, Conqueror Napoleon Bonaparte. Stay with us, and we continue. Your background doesn't matter. Focus on personal qualities. Yes, we must certainly admit that he, the Emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, eventually suffered a fiasco. Although he had every chance of victory, his military talent was unmatched by anyone in all Europe, and his soldiers followed him into the fire, into the desert, and into the snow. And from the very beginning of his bright and rapid career, which could hardly have been predicted by anyone who knew the Bonaparte family tree. After all, before that, very few natives of Corsica became famous outside this poorly developed Mediterranean island. Nevertheless, the son of a poor nobleman and official succeeded, and he considered the main lesson of his youth to be the recognition of the important fact that a person's origin is not so important. Far more important than his personal abilities or rather social prejudices were always irrelevant to Napoleon. This later played a role in the selection of generals for his humongous army. But the young people who studied with him in the cadet corps thought otherwise. So the young cadet had no friends. Those around him simply considered it shameful to communicate with him. More so, he didn't hide his Corsican origin and disliked the mainland French. Well, they don't want to and they don't have to, but there was time for study and self-education, especially since Napoleon was going to enter a school of artillery. And there, you need more knowledge than anywhere else in the army. By the way, that's why they looked not at origin of a person, but at the ability to accurately calculate the trajectory of gunfire. The next step in the career of the future emperor was the Paris Military School, where he entered at the age of 15. He had mastered the art of war decently well, but at the same time another change took place with him. Bonaparte ceased to look askance at everything French and gradually became saturated with the spirit of this domineering country. And by the time he began his professional military career, he underwent a very important change. From a Corsican, he became a true Frenchman. Thus, he demonstrated that he knows how to change in accordance with the new circumstances. Paris is a worthy place. Napoleon remembered the famous phrase of King Henry IV, and now being a prisoner of the English somewhere on a distant island, he again agreed with it. If he had remained a local Corsican patriot, he would never have become what all Europe knew him to be. And then died his father, and although Napoleon was the second son, it was he who became the formal head of the family after that, and he had to earn money to support it, but the payment in his regiment was irregular, so he began to think about the prospect of going into the service of another state. In those days, such transitions between states were considered quite normal and were met with acceptance. Reminding himself of this episode, Bonaparte smiled sharply. What a mocking grimace of fate! For a year before the French Revolution, he tried to enlist in the service of the Russian army. Moreover, the documents were prepared and he legally could go to serve. But just a few days before that, a decree came according to which foreigners were recruited with a reduction in rank by one step below. Of course, this didn't suit the ambitious Corsican, or was he already a Frenchman? Nonetheless, and he remained to serve in France. We can wonder if it weren't for this decree, what would he have been able to achieve in Russian Empire? Respect is one of the keys to success and wealth. In the subsequent year, however, things took a turn in his country in such a way that the neighboring countries at first watched with interest. But when the former King Louis XVI was executed by the convention in early 1793, they didn't like it very much. And the time of the Revolutionary Wars began, when Napoleon actually showed his talents to the fullest. Yes, in turbulent times, the situation can lift social elevators especially high, however, as well as lower down. A great many in France at that time could attest to this, if they hadn't ended up on the guillotine. But Bonaparte managed to avoid such an unenviable fate. His career went up rapidly, so he went from Major to Brigadier General in just 3 fast months, at the age of 24. He was entrusted with the command of grandiose armies. He then became Consul of the Republic and then Emperor. The entire path from the very bottom, a local voiceless Corsican, to the top of power was made in a little more than a decade. It was a glorious time. But at first it was truly hard. The young general had to win the hardest thing, trust of the army, in which the situation at that time was simply terrible. There was simply no treasury as such, there was no money even for postal expenses. The soldiers too were a rather pitiful sight in their tattered uniforms, and some were even without shoes. Napoleon remembered the very first formation. Those who gathered for it could be mistaken for wandering musicians or even, well, beggars, but not for the regular army of such a country as France. On the other hand, the plump faces of the quartermasters spoke graphically for themselves. Well, it was clear to him at once what to do, or rather where to begin. He started with them, ordering to shoot the pillaging bastards with the confiscation of their property. Thus, he made it clear that he would no longer allow any theft and would severely punish those caught in it. And then he issued an order which was unprecedented at the time, categorically prohibiting corporal punishment and dishonoring of soldiers by officers in the army, also under threat of shooting violators. Napoleon was always convinced that a man without honor simply could not be a hero, and by his order he returned it to the soldiers, who immediately felt humanely treated. Thus, he showed himself to be an honest and rational commander, a real father-like figure to the soldiers, who takes care of them and endures all the hardships of army life on an equal basis with them, because he respects his subordinates, considering them not shallow tool-like tools, but complete and respectable part of army. And if someone thought all this was ridicule and pretty inadequate, then they were surely very mistaken. The morale in his army very quickly rose to the unrivaled height. Encouraged by the changes that were taking place, the soldiers began to literally work miracles on the battlefield, overthrowing the outnumbered armies of the anti-French coalition. Moreover, they withstood previously prohibitive physical exertion, marching 60 or 70 kilometers per night, and then straight up engaging the enemy, who seemed to be rested and definitely better armed, but nevertheless was defeated. For he was not in a position to resist such a colossal upsurge of confidence among the French. The greatest military commander at the head of his soldiers who are devoid of fighting spirit turns out to be complete mediocrity. General Bonaparte once remarked, and he was quite right, morale and motivation, these things are groundbreaking and can truly break a lot of possible and impossible expectations. In any situation, there is a place for classic solutions and thoughts. But this wasn't enough for ultimate victory, and therefore Napoleon added another factor to the scales, his extraordinary military talent. And then there's the out-of-the-box thinking that dramatically increased the effectiveness of combat operations. He tried in every possible way to avoid acting according to templates and sought maximum flexibility, combining sometimes seemingly at first glance incompatible things. For instance, in those days, almost all European commanders used the so-called linear formation, which made it possible to achieve the maximum density of fire. Though, at the same time, it was completely inflexible and extremely vulnerable to attack from the flank and even more so from the rear. Bonaparte often took advantage of this, striking unexpected blows and employing deceptive maneuvers, as at Austerlitz, one of the most influential battles in history. At this thought, Napoleon sighed. At that time, he heavily underestimated the Russian army and considered it too weak, and therefore decided to go to war with the Russian Empire in the summer of 1812. If he just could rewind time and replay everything in details, but even the emperors are incapable of this. Money doesn't have to be an end in itself, it's just your means. You don't serve money, money serves you. Yes, by the end of the first decade of the 19th century, the once poor and introverted Corsican had become one of the most powerful and wealthy men on the European continent, which is not surprising, because he had at his disposal the resources not only of the whole of France, but also of the countries dependent on it. In passing, during his short stay in Moscow, he managed to take out a huge wagon with gold, silver, jewelry, and other expensive things, but it never got to France. It had to be left in Russia, well hidden. However, now he doesn't even need to think about where exactly. If this wealth doesn't belong to him, let no one get it. However, although Bonaparte did not disdain luxurious items, he didn't consider it the essence of life. Wealth does not consist in the possession of treasuries, but in the use which one knows how to give them. He once uttered such a phrase, thereby revealing that money is not an end for him, but only a means. And he never hit his goal, to become the ruler of all of Europe. And he succeeded, well, almost. Napoleon once again sighed heavily and wrapped himself warmly in a blanket. Night was falling, one of many that he had already experienced and that he had yet to live through. Thank you for watching. Enjoyed this episode? Subscribe to Wealth History as well as leave a like. It would help our channel grow and help motivate us to produce much more content for you. And for now, see you later on Wealth History.